could ask councillors to be seated, please, and we'll get underway on item number 9. And while councillors are getting seated, if I can call to the table Ross Tucker, Andrew Duncan and Bobby Parkinson, I think are the three officials, and we have more officers in the back of the room if we need them. Ross, are you going to be accompanied there, or?
Yep, and Andrew will join me, and we might bring up other people as we need to.
Right. Okay. Item number 9 was the subject, of course, of a workshop. I'm trying to remember, was it this week or last week?
This week.
One week becomes the next. So we've got some background on that, and I think our officers have taken on board some of the comments that were made in the workshop and will report back to us on that today. What we're agreeing to do today, if we pass the recommendations, is to go out to consultation, in particular with the development community, on the changes in policy. And I think there's been a change in the time frame so that we'll have the chance for some of the stakeholders to make representations a week later than was originally proposed on the 20th of November, I think. Another issue that came up was a question around the manner in which the $730 million that we've voted in the long-term plan, the 10-year budget for parks acquisition, how that is divided up between local parks, sports grounds and regional reserves. And I think that's a really interesting question. I think we need to give some time to that. Yep. But what I would suggest with to officers, that we actually have a separate workshop on that question, which is separate from the question of what we're discussing today, which is development contributions. I think it is important that we understand how the funding, it's a huge amount of funding, $730 million, we're acquiring new public open space. How do we allocate that between the competing areas for it? So suggest to officers that we don't take time up today because it's a side issue to what we're focused on, but that we do come back and have a workshop on that particular topic. I'll just make a note of the fact that in our 10-year budget, of course, for parks and community investment, we increased that by over 50% from $2.4 billion to $3.7 billion. Yep. So we have made a huge commitment of additional funds in this area. So it's not a case of continually adding to the amount of funds we've got, but how we best spend that money for the public good. Ross, I think you're going to lead off on discussion, but before you do that, maybe if I move pro forma the recommendations, seconded by the Deputy Mayor Cashmore, and Ross, if you lead off, and then we'll go through questions and comments on the paper.
Okay, thank you. I'll just give a bit of background around the contributions policy and the decision that we're seeking today, which is about agreement to consult on a draft policy. And then I'll hand over to Andrew Duncan to just touch on some of those issues that arose from that workshop earlier this week. So firstly, development contributions are a key part of how we fund our recently agreed 10-year budget. So that 10-year budget, as you recall, includes $26 billion of investment over the next 10 years. And as the Mayor's indicated, it includes significant additional investment in the parks and community area, also significant investment in the transport area. Because our current contributions policy expires at the end of January next year, we need to go out and consult and then agree and put in place a new contributions policy by early next year at the latest, in order to get the revenue that we need so that we can give effect to our long-term plan and crack on with building all of that infrastructure that's planned in there. We also need to work within the constraints of legislation, and in terms of the contributions legislation, that means in particular we have to have a very clear evidential link of the basis of the link between the infrastructure that we are charging for and then how the demand arises from different types of developments and different locations. So the law is very clear. If we don't have good evidential-based decision-making around those linkages, then that reduces our ability to charge contributions. So today we're specifically asking for your approval to go out and consult on a draft policy. We want to go out and have a good conversation with the development community. We see that as a continuation of a discussion we've been having with the development community in Auckland for many years. It's been a good two-way communication exercise. This time we have got an extensive program with lots of feedback and engagement events across the region. And we are very keen to hear what the development community has to say. We're very keen that they understand what we're trying to do and that they have an opportunity to input into the policy to make sure it's as fair as possible. As an example of that, at the last consultation exercise we had, the feedback was it was too rushed. There wasn't enough information coming forward to support it. So this time we have taken more time. We have 4 weeks of consultation, and this consultation is going to be supported by a much richer set of collateral, quite detailed CapEx schedules and other information about how the contributions policy works. So that's us responding to previous feedback, and we're very keen to hear what the development community has to say this time around. So I'll pass over to Andrew to talk about some of those issues that were raised earlier this week.
Thank you, Ross. Andrew.
So you had a few questions of us and raised a few issues at the workshop we held earlier this week. In regards to open space investment, you were looking at how that interacted with our contributions policy. So the investment decisions for the council in parks, driven by the Auckland Plan, development strategy, our open space provision policy, made on a prioritised basis within the budgets that's set in the long-term plan. And the DC policy provides a mechanism to recover some of the cost of that with development contributions. It covers the growth part of the cost. As the Mayor said, our investments in parks and communities increased substantially in this 10-year budget. We've got Ian and Paul to talk to you shortly about perhaps having a workshop, as the Mayor suggested, to look at these investment decisions and the questions you had about them, how they've been implemented in response to the Council's other policies, development strategy, open space provision policy. Just repeating, the development contributions are recovering the cost of that, and so if you make any changes to the investment plans, then we can adjust our contributions policy following that to reflect those decisions. The policy is our cost recovery mechanism that follows through on your investment decisions. That's something that it's a live policy, and we can update that over time as the investment decisions change. You also had some questions about our changes to, or proposed changes to transport demand factors, and in particular, we've reviewed our trip generation statistics, and that's given us the view that we should be making some adjustments to transport demand factors. So it looks like from this information, retail and commercial development should pay more, and other development types, including residential, should pay a bit less. We've included, we're going to amend how we set DC's document that will go out for consultation to include the list of the 5 data sources we use for trip generation data. So that anyone looking at these documents, they can see that material. There's website links there, and you can see what the trip generation data is telling us at quite a detailed level for those who are interested. And that'll be of help to the community, and particular developers, when they're looking at the proposal. They can see the basis upon which we did that work. We'll be able to get their feedback and consider their views. And you'll be able to consider those too when you make your decisions in December. Also, if you wish, we've got one of our colleagues here from Transport to talk about some of that trip generation data if you wish. In addition, we've made, finally, in response to other questions at the meeting, we've provided a bit more time from between when submissions close and when the community will have an opportunity to present directly to councillors. So you asked to have some time to be able to look at the submissions before you heard the presentation from those providing feedback. So we've rescheduled the proposed date of the 16th of Friday the 16th of November to Friday the 23rd of November for that to take place.
Ian.
Your Worship. Look, just further to the comments from Your Worship, where we can come back to councillors and have a workshop with respect to the priorities, the mechanisms, the way of funding parks right across the city. It's a complicated business, and it's one which I think needs to be undertaken in a fulsome manner, as some of the decisions are likely to be tested later, perhaps in courts, as we try to implement them. So perhaps rather than try and go through it now, I think certainly the Mayor's concept of having a separate workshop to look at those issues is very important. But we can run through how decisions are made with respect to local parks, the level of priorities, how it relates to growth, regional parks. I know that was an issue raised at the discussion in the earlier workshop as to how they are funded and some possibilities how they could be funded in the future. But we're certainly able to come back to you around a workshop on those issues.
That's great. Thank you very much for that, Ian. If there's no further comment from the end of the table, we'll just move into questions. I've got an extensive list already that's growing by the minute. So we'll start off with Councillor Stewart.
Thank you. Just on the development contributions for stormwater, when we have infill housing in, say, the brownfields areas, the development contribution is taken, but for what I can see, especially out my way at the moment, we've got a lot of flooding and stormwater issues. I can't see the money that's been collected in those areas being put back into the stormwater to you know, so somebody might do an infill housing or whatever, and they might put in their own stormwater for the catchment, and everybody keeps on saying, well, it's wonderful, we're upgrading, well, we've had all of this done, but all the other houses surrounding it are not actually connected into the stormwater catchment, and we're having all this flooding. So what I would like to see is that the money that's been collected from development contributions, and the part of it that is for stormwater, is used in that particular area, and the houses that are surrounding the development that's just gone in, there's some connections, because in my area we've got people still not living in their houses from the April weather event, and they haven't got insurance to cover any further extreme weather events. So this is really a serious matter, so I'd like you to address that. Thank you.
Maybe we could use answering this question as a means of just spelling out what the legislation requires from the development contributions we charge, because there's a specificity about that. The money we take from a particular development needs to go into particular projects, and we need to abide by that legislative requirement, or our development contribution charges will be overturned.
So this is also some more specificity of the kind that you're also asking for, Councillor, was asked of us by developers in May, meets with our legislative requirements to be as specific as we can about how the money is going to be used. So we've increased substantially the level of detail that backs up the proposed policy, and there's a what page number, Ross? There's quite an extent, there's a very detailed list in the document and in the papers that you have today. I'll try and find the page number for you. It includes the stormwater projects by area, and we've got quite a large number of smaller catchment areas for stormwater, so you can see what is proposed in those areas and where the development contributions charges are going. But I'll ask Mark from our Healthy Waters team to respond in a bit more detail to your question.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
The flooding that we're currently experiencing around Auckland, and particularly in the eastern suburbs, is a factor of the existing housing plus the new growth. So we do have a number of projects we have identified in the area to manage that flooding. Part will be funded by development contributions, but some will also be general rates in terms of flood response. Because because that flooding is linked to the existing housing plus the new housing. So we do have a number of projects we are looking at. Catchment areas, as Andrew was saying, we have about 15 catchments that we use for different development contributions. And therefore there's 15 different price factors depending on the issues within that catchment related to growth.
I'd just like to, for you to take back to Healthy Waters that I really, really appreciate all the work that they're doing out there at the moment. They have actually really gone above and beyond. Thank you.
So the specific list of stormwater projects to be funded by DCs is at page 211 of your agenda, and the catchment maps for stormwater are on page 243.
243. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Richard Hills.
Yes, I talked about, thank you, Chair. I spoke about this the other day at the workshop, and I'm not sure if it's a question for the finance team or transport, but I am really concerned about how we measure the retail versus production travel movements. Like, it's a pretty hefty increase for retail, and the example even given here on, say, a mall, I'm just concerned how that is apportioned when maybe a car trip or a walking trip or a cycle trip or a bus trip to that area, how it's spread across, say, one person going to 5 stores. Is that included for each store, or the one building, or the one town centre? And the other issue is the weighting. So people going to a production, like a quarry or I don't know what, but they're obviously going to be using heavier vehicles that may have more wear and tear on the roading than maybe a retired person driving to a store or something once a week. So I just want to know how it actually measures the use, and if it's just an arbitrary humans going to a site.
So in looking at the trip generation data, we've set out a little in our report to you, and also in a bit more detail in how we set DCs, which accompanies the consultation document, some of the factors that we considered. So we looked at the raw trip generation data, but we also then made some adjustments to reflect the fact that people will often go from one place to another, stopping somewhere along the way.
Yep.
The trip generation data does include things like shopping malls. So all of this is weighted in there. There's access to that information going to be provided in our document for those to have a look at it, and particularly developers. And we do recognise that it's quite a major increase, although it is very similar to what our neighbouring cities do. I'll have John Davies from the Auckland Forecasting Centre, who's got a good grasp of how trip generation data works, and he may be able to add something to what I've said.
What Andrew said is essentially the process that's followed. There are factors in the trip generation rates that do allow for what we call multi-purpose trips, which tend to be reduction factors, because you don't really want to double count the entire trip as independent trips if they are multi-use trips or multi-leg trips. So those factors are built into the process. I can't offhand verify what the factors are and what they should be, but I think it's important to note that they are there, and they do attempt to apportion trips in a more fair and equitable way between the different beneficiaries of activities that require trip making. I'm not quite sure if that answers your question.
I guess, and I know I'm using anecdotal examples, but you know, say a truck goes to a production or distribution place, and they're going to probably travel further with a heavier vehicle, and you know, then say someone driving from their home to a mall in a car. And are you including trip generation? Does that include walking, cycling, public transport, or are you only including vehicle crossings of that from the road to the unit?
Historically, the trip generation rates refer to vehicle trips, and that would include generally all types of vehicles, including heavy axle vehicles. On the topic of heavy vehicles, I guess those do get taxed and pay contributions in other avenues.
Yep.
So that would form part of the greater pool. But in this case, I don't think there's much differentiation on particular land uses. That can be accommodated in the actual rates that are levied by a particular land use if it's deemed to be heavily weighted towards heavy trucks, for example. So there are other mechanisms where you can adjust the rates charged if it's deemed appropriate to that particular activity. I think one of the issues with the trip generation rates is that we do tend to work on averages. Averages have their problems, but they also have a lot of advantages. But you're never going to match every precise activity at any particular time precisely.
So, but, yeah, maybe I'm not reading it right, but so say Queen Street, someone opens or builds a new retail store on Queen Street or somewhere like that, or that basically they might not have a vehicle crossing, so it's very hard to even show that you're getting vehicle trip generators. They're still going to pay $18,000 per 100 square metres.
So that example was included so that it will be quite clear the sort of order of magnitude we're talking about. But the actual charge would vary depending on the part of the city and the
Right,
investment required in that area. But I wanted, by putting that example, and I wanted to make it quite abundantly clear that it was a big change that we're proposing to consult on to get feedback. Actual weight is an important factor in considering transport investment and the nature of the roads, but congestion is as well. And one truck might be a lot heavier on the road, but it doesn't take up as much space as multiple numbers of cars. So they've got that balance as well. And trip generation is used at a strategic level, just advised. It's an important aspect in that context. I'd also note that the raw averages between retail and domestic is about 13 to 1, whereas the charging ratio is 2.8 to 1. So there's quite a bit of raw adjustment being made already. But it'll be good to get the community and development community's views back on these proposals as well.
It just feels wrong, but I guess
I think, just to be clear, trip generation is about volume. It's not about weight. Weight's dealt with through road user charges. That depends on axle limits, etc. Is that correct?
That is definitely one element, Mr. Mayor. I mean, the other element is also that the cost of building, for example, a heavier road would also depend on the area and the use of that road. So your cost would also vary from area to area, and that would then fall out of how you needed to portion your infrastructure costs in general areas. So if it's a commercial area with a lot of heavy trucks, the road pavements would be stronger and would cost more, and that would be a more area-based cost, which could presumably be taken up by different factors by area.
Yeah. I think for most of us this is pretty complex and technical stuff, but obviously we're going to benefit from the feedback we get on the proposal from those in the development community, and we'll fine-tune it accordingly. If we're demonstrated to be wrong on something, we've got an open mind, we'll make the adjustments accordingly. So I'm not sure that we're going to get something that we fully comprehend. I certainly don't, but the process should help us get to the right point, I'm hoping. Thank you. Is Councillor Wayne Walker?
Yeah. I think my first question goes to the Mayor's comment that he doesn't fully comprehend what we've got here, and I'd suggest most of us don't, and I'd suggest that the development community may to a certain extent, but as far as the general public is concerned, I consider it incredibly difficult. They're making a submission on this. So I've got a question then, and that is, how can we make it easier for the general public to understand what we're going out with here? And I guess I'd preface that with the question, how significant are development contributions in terms of our budget relative to, let's say, greenfields development? And I think there's a self-evident answer around that, but I'll leave that to you. And then brownfield. So how important are these numbers?
It is. So development contributions are one of the ways we pay for growth infrastructure. It is a big number. It's multiple billions of dollars. So it is significant investment, significant funding source that funds significant investment. So it is important part of how council manages its finances. In terms of making this clear to the community, we've worked pretty hard to try to come up with consultation documents and materials that explain the issues at a high level, using diagrams and maps where we can. Is when you get into the details of how trip generation works, it is the nature of how you charge at that detail level is complicated. There is not a lot we can do to make the complex really simple, but we have tried to put what are the key issues into our consultation document, have one page that explains what is happening with overall charging levels, what is happening with demand factors, and try to make that as simple as possible. And so on start on page 266, you'll see this sort of the one-page explanation, and then layered in behind that is a methodology document. Layered in behind that is 5 detailed technical reports on transport trips. So it's kind of, we see it as a hierarchy of different layers of detailed information.
So if somebody in the community, say somebody on the Hibiscus Coast or on the North Shore or the like, wants to get a handle on how this affects them into the future, bearing in mind this is 10 years, is there any way that we can express a quantity of reserves or a particular improvement around community facilities that we could express pictorially as it goes to an area of land, for example?
So based on your feedback from the workshop earlier this week, Councillor, we did have a look at is there a way to simply explain in terms of this policy how many hectares of land or how many kilometres of road we get. That all gets very complicated very quickly, and in the time available we weren't able to come up with any kind of soundbite facts and figures that we could safely use and ensure that they're evidentially based. So I think it's a good concept to try to turn the complex financial piece into what does it mean in terms of on-the-ground infrastructure on average across the region. But I think we'd need to take a bit more time to work through that to deliver that.
Would it be possible to even give a very small number of examples so that somebody can see how the policy translates into something real for, let's say, a given area? So people can comprehend it.
Yeah. So in the consultation document, we've tried to include some maps and some key areas. So in the north, how do the contributions work? How does that fit in with the broad infrastructure planning? So starting on page 262, you'll see some maps of different, how does contributions work in some areas. It doesn't go down into the detail of particular numbers and average charges because the charges do vary by type of development. But we've tried to put some maps and pictures that try to explain in simple terms what is the essence of what we're trying to achieve here.
Do we do any work, any focus group work with something like this where we take some people out there in the community and we put this to them and we ask them whether they can understand it or not? Just as a matter of interest, given that this is so significant?
We haven't looked at focus groups for this exercise. We kind of see that the Have You Say events is where we are taking this out to the community, and they will make these documents available. We will invite feedback on, and if they give us feedback on how we present as well as the content, then we're happy to accept that and improve over time.
Okay, just got a question around parks, and I've looked through the list of parks acquisition. Is there anything in there in the list of park acquisitions that's for a regional park or not?
No, so there's nothing specifically in there to acquire new regional parks. There are, I guess we need to be careful about definitions. We have regional we have budgets that are held regionally versus ones that are held locally. So we have a significant investment that is at a regional level, but it is looking, the investment, the response to growth is about investing in sports parks, other parks across the
I
region.
understand that.
And Ian can give more detail.
My simple question is there any regional park acquisition? I mean,
No, at the moment there isn't, and that is something that can be discussed at this workshop that we've talked about.
do you think that's a useful piece of information to communicate to people so they know? I mean, if we assume that regional parks are important to people, and historically we've had a program of acquiring regional parks, but we're not doing that now, is that something we should be communicating in a few words?
Perhaps if I can explain. So the regional parks are funded out of rates primarily, although we also have had additions by gifts, investments by owners and developers. So over the last few years there have been decisions made by council to invest ratepayer funding as opposed to development contributions, and also lands that have been vested. Regional parklands are one of those items which I think it'd be worthwhile talking through at the workshop. So there is a strong view around regional parks being purchased for things such as landscapes, the environment, conservation, and also for human recreation. But it's not purely related to growth, and this is where development contributions come in. So that's the sort of thing I think we could talk about as to what role might development contributions play with regional parks. But as of today, it's ratepayer funding for grants.
So if we pick up on that, should we then be communicating that we do not have any proposals for any ratepayer funding for regional parks? Because my understanding is that that is the case.
The purpose of this consultation is to explain, well, what is it that the development contributions are doing, what does it pay for? There's any range of things that development contributions are not paying for. So the focus here is, well, we're consulting on an increase in development contribution charges and a new policy, so we need to be, the law requires us to go and explain what is it that DCs are paying for.
Can I maybe just seek a little bit of clarification following on from Councillor Walker's questions? My understanding from our workshop is that it's much easier to allocate the cost of a local reserve to a development contribution, because the growth requires that, than it is to allocate a development contribution to a regional park, so that regional parks are largely funded out of alternative rates funding rather than development contributions. Is my assumption correct?
Yes.
That's correct. The law requires that we must show that link between growth and the demand for regional parks.
So,
and perhaps Ian could comment on that.
Can I just clarify another point too, arising out of Councillor Walker's questions? I mean, for the wider public, the broader picture needs to be painted. Why are we going for more development contributions? Because we have major growth, and that growth is putting pressure on our resources. What's the ballpark figure of the difference in revenue that the new proposed policy for development contributions will bring to council? What does it go from and to?
So the current plan and the DC policy is recovering 2.2 million over 10 years, and the proposal, in line with the investment decisions you've made on the long-term plan, would see us recover 2.7 million over the coming 10 years.
Billion.
A billion, sorry,
Billion.
yes.
Yeah, sorry. I was
talking about
I was thinking that, what are we sitting here for? Yeah, okay, so it goes from 2.2 to
2.7.
2.7. You're talking about $500 million.
Correct.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you very much. You finished, Councillor?
So just further to the issue that the Mayor raised around the link, do we have some research on the link between the increase in population and the increased requirement for regional parks?
So the link is loose. So we know that over the last few years, the 6 million visitors each year, growing at about 20%. So there's that sort of link with the overall population. But to be able to say we have purchased additional regional parkland purely to provide for that, as opposed to landscape protection, environment, habitat, it's more difficult. And I think that's the sort of issue we can discuss. And needs to be undertaken in a way which can subsequently be justified, I suspect, before the courts if a change is made around funding. But we do have data.
So if we do some work in this area and we do find that we need more biodiversity across the region, that we need more regional parks for a whole range of reasons, climate change and the like, how quickly can we change our contributions regime to reflect that, if we do that work?
Quite quickly. So we would have an obligation to consult, but it's not an annual, not a set time each year we have to do it, and we have made changes to the policy in response to other factors in relatively short spaces of time, following an appropriate consultation, of course.
So I'll just put up my hand and say, quite quickly sounds good to me, let's get on with it.
Thank you very much. Councillor Fletcher.
I had another question.
Well, okay, quickly please.
And that is, I understand development contributions, which are effectively collecting revenue to fund things for extra growth across stormwater and transport and the like. Do we have any incentives for people on their properties to deal with their transport, their stormwater, their water, their sewage issues, so that they're not impacting on the bigger picture? So the person that wants to deal with their own sewage, that wants to deal with their own water, that doesn't want to have a car, that wants to do something or the like, are there any incentives for that?
Bit wide
Certainly
of what we're looking at today, but have a go.
Yeah, in the context of the development contributions policy, if not for transport or water and wastewater, which is a water care issue, but in relation to stormwater, if you manage your stormwater yourself and it flows to sea, for example, then we don't charge.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you, Your Worship. I really welcome this piece of work, and before I put my question to you, I've enjoyed being part of a number of workshops over a few years now that is seeing a lot of this coming to fruition, and working from that principle of growth must pay for growth has been really satisfying to see it come together. And I've been quite excited about some of the methodologies that you've put forward, in terms of units of demand for activities and things, trying to get a much more sophisticated regime. I am, in asking my question, I am not in any way putting pressure on officers, because I believe the concern, and I want to explore this issue of regional parks. Well, I welcome the willingness of the Mayor to say that we can have a workshop on this. I think that when you're putting an item out for consultation, there has to be transparency about issues that might occur in the future. And from my perspective, the issue of regional parks has been known to members of the governing body. It was discussed at the adoption of the LTP. I mean, we asked some of us questions at the time and discovered the answer, which is it's approximately only in the 10-year period, 450 odd, I can't remember the exact amount, but less than half the cost of the average house in Auckland over a 10-year period. Now you might say, well, all that other money is going to parks and that's fabulous. The reality is there are going to be, there are differences, and I want Ian to reflect on what the differences are on regional parks to destinational parks and small reserves and so forth. I believe that with the growth that we're experiencing, that there is methodology around the regional parks being those destinations and the use of those regional parks. And I think that we shouldn't close our mind just because it's hard to actually try to quantify some of those values, particularly in light of the fact that some of our regional parks, because of Kari dieback, will be closing, and that we know that is an expectation of the people of Auckland region, that we do continue to provide regional parks. So Ian, while I welcome the workshop, I do think there should be some visibility about the potential for funds to be available for the future. The last regional park, as we discussed at the workshop, was Fernglen. of which Auckland Council only funded a third, because we had the ability to have some seeding funds, and that was actually part of a partnership where we brought people together. Now, the whole idea of...
Sorry, councillor, can I just get you to come to the question, because we're in the question
I'm coming
session
to the
still?
question. If you go through all of the projects that are listed from page 211 right through into the end of that agenda report, there is not one specific regional park reference. Now, the law requires, around development contributions, that there is specificity. It's something that I welcome, because I think it gives the kind of accountability and transparency that the public expect from us. So I want you, because we've had workshops on this in the past, I want you to differentiate between regional parks and the general parks, and I want you to talk about what we have discussed in terms of possibility of weaving these into the future, because I would like to see some funds being available that we can take opportunities and create partnerships into the future. So I'm asking you to respond to that, Ian, please.
So look, in very short terms, our local parks, so these are the things at the bottom of your street or within your neighbourhood, are designed to service a catchment, and we often talk about sort of a walking distance into that catchment or an easy drive. It's not quite as easy as that, because some parks have specialist facilities, and we can only provide a number of those across the region, so people do travel, examples being playgrounds. But there is a very clear link to additional people and additional utilisation, and we were able to show that to developers and others. Regional parks are a little different. We obtain or purchase those for a variety of reasons, one of which is certainly recreation. They draw their people from a much wider area, although a good majority still come from a local area, but they can come from right across our region. But we also purchase them and operate them for a range of reasons other than recreation. So these are environmental reasons, habitat reasons, landscapes, particularly important landscapes across our region. So it's that link, particularly to the environment, to the landscapes, etc., that is more difficult to actually link back to development contributions, and that's been the issue. We do have data that shows recreation utilisation is rising, and it's that sort of information that we think, particularly if we go through it in a workshop and we're able to do it in a fulsome way, that we may be able to look at making the link between development and contributions to utilisations within our regional parks.
The point that I want to get, and if we are to have a workshop, and I'm very pleased you're offering it, but there must be some visibility on this, because when the offer of regional parks has been put forward to this governing body over the last 8 years, population growth has always been a factor that has been included. So there seems to be an inconsistency now that we are, and it's not at officers. I think officers are being asked to defend the indefensible. We have been remiss in not ensuring at the time of the LTP there were some funds that could be included in those pages that I've referred to, and there's nothing there. It is possible for these measurements to come into play, but I would be very disappointed if we go up to consultation and then at some future point we realise, oh, we should have done that, but oh, we didn't do it in the consultation and therefore we can't do it now, and it's just going to put more of a ratepayer burden in a way that I believe it shouldn't be a ratepayer burden. I believe that, well, we've been told by officers in the past when we've made these acquisitions, it's because the pressure on the parks, because of the population growth. Would we have had another regional park since 2010 added to the list if the population had remained at 1 million people? Probably not. So I hope that we can have an intelligent workshop on this and a degree of openness on it, and know that when we come to adopt the budgets in the future, that we are actually interrogating this and ensuring that we have actually factored that in.
I think we will cover this under the workshop, but the advice we're getting today is that there is a limited ability to fund regional parks out of development contributions. The issue itself is an important issue that we need to come to terms with, I agree, but development contributions will only make a limited contribution to that, is the message I'm I'm hearing time and
In black
again
and
from
white?
officials.
I'd like a legal opinion on that.
Yep, well, maybe that's something, Ian, you can come back to and include in the workshop. Councillor Cooper.
Mine is, notwithstanding all the questions we've had, is actually about, because this is about going out for consultation, I'm going to be very parochial. Western Springs Garden Hall is only 5k from the CBD, so I know it's got Western in the name of the building, but I've had complaints from people in the West before about consulting for the West at Western Springs Gardens. So I would really ask you if you would change that. You know, we've got a hall at Sunderland Hall, which is a council hall at Hobsonville, and that's where all the development's going on, is up there. You know, Coomew, Red Hills and Hobsonville. So that's my question to you. I just don't think it's acceptable to have Western consultation at Western Springs. Thank you.
The
I think
location
if
of
you
the
could look at that one again, I went to the long-term plan, and that was a point made by almost everybody at the meeting. Why have you got it in town when you say this is consultation for the West?
Yeah, and
5k from here.
that's an important point, and we said
Off the isthmus, yeah.
that's an important point, and we were quite concerned when we designed the consultation that we were doing it in a way that reflected what would suit the community, and particularly the development community. So we wrote to all the developers asking them where they'd like to have the consultation, and based on the responses we got, we set them telling us where they wanted to meet with us. We set up events that anyone can come to, but certainly in response to the developers' feedback to us in Manukau, Takapuna and in central Auckland. I think it's located here. In response to their requests.
5k away from Western Springs.
Well, this is where they told us they wanted to meet, and so we responded to them. We set up something in Western Springs in the evening to provide an opportunity for members of the public in particular, and that's open to everyone, and that was a central venue, so central for everyone in the region who's not available during office hours to come to. So that wasn't designed as the Western event, bearing in mind the comments you made,
There isn't
Councillor.
a Western event then.
Okay,
Because the developers let us know where they wanted to meet.
thank you. Councillor Mike Lee.
Thank you. I share the concerns of members in regard to regional parks. However, I'm listening to Mr Maxwell and taking it from him that it's not so easy to dedicate money from development contributions to regional parks. So I'm quite happy to accept that and draw a line under it. The key is not where the money comes from regional parks. The key thing is that there is money for regional parks from wherever bucket it comes from. We, in the last few years, the Super City, ironically, has been quite weak in terms of progressing regional parks in keeping with the growth and population of the region. And I guess a workshop about regional parks would be quite helpful. So I accept what everyone is saying, that there is a real concern that we get some money to continue to support and expand our regional park system, but at the same time it may be a hard ask to get it from development contributions. So okay, that's not the only place where we can get money from. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. We've kind of morphed from questions into comments, but are there any further comments before we take this to
Got a
the
further
vote?
question. Well, I've
Sorry?
got a further question, Mr Chair.
Further question? Councillor Walker?
And that is, given, I would suggest, the huge public interest in this, would it be possible for the officers to put together some form of green paper to look at the options going forward that Aucklanders might consider, over and above having a workshop? Because, as I say, this is something of huge public interest, and I would suggest there are many people out there concerned about the lack of investment going forward into regional parks, particularly given the context of the explosive population increase we've had in recent years. So is there another way of doing this, or an additional way of doing this? And I'd invite a comment from perhaps Matthew around that.
Well, Can I suggest this is exactly the topic that we need to look at in terms of our workshop on regional parks? We have collectively voted more than 50% more for community facilities and open spaces. If there is, and I think there is a proper debate to be had around whether we are fairly allocating that extra expenditure in the areas where it's most needed. But that will be, I think, at the heart of the workshop that we're holding. So I think if we can hold that over it and have that debate in the proper place.
So my question wasn't about a workshop. That's great. My question is around putting some information out there so that members of the public, particularly across Auckland that have an interest around this, can consider it.
Well, I think before we put out a paper, we've got to work out what councillors feel about it, and that's what the workshop is intended to do. So let's do it in the proper sequence. We've got comments now. Councillor...
Sorry, questions?
Questions, sorry, yeah.
Still on questions, because we've...
No, I've just moved to comments, but if you've got a question and I've overlooked you, please ask the question.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just in terms of the payment, and I'm referring to page 161, there's a change there to making the payment at, and I think that's for multi-unit developments, isn't it? Residential developments, at the point of application for code compliance certificate. I'm correct in that regard. So have we checked that with legal, that particular part with legal? Are there risks in that delay? Are we taking into account multi-unit developments that can take 2 and 3 years, and therefore the code compliance can be very late, but the city's infrastructure has been, it's in the process of being paid for by that time. So I'm just wondering whether there should be a limit on that it's code compliance certificate up to a maximum of 12 months after the issuance of the building consent. Have you considered those implications?
We have had all of the documentation checked and approved by our legal team, and it's also been externally reviewed as well. So we've had external legal advice. The payment timing, our view from our statistics is that on average it's about 12 months for code compliance certificate. The additional cost of that to us has been included in our financial forecast, so we've budgeted for that, and it's included in our cost recovery. It's a small proportion of the overall development. Minimum. And they must pay within 2 years, so there is a cap.
Oh, there is the cap, okay.
Yeah, but 12 months is sort of the average the team was thinking about. We've costed it in, and we're quite confident in the security of our payment. We've written off 74,000 of DC debt over 700 million invoiced in the last 8 years.
Okay, just another question, and I'm thinking of the affordability of housing. I note that there are no remissions or waivers for DCs provided here. Where would the council examine the possibility of providing relief to the payment of development contributions where so-called, and to be determined how this is defined, affordable housing is guaranteed in perpetuity by either tenure of rent or tenure of ownership? Where would the council examine that? In the DC policy, or is it outside the DC policy?
So it wouldn't be within the DC policy, because we can't then pass the infrastructure costs for those developments on to other developers, because legally we can only charge developers for their fair share of the growth costs. So the appropriate mechanism to consider that would be through a grants process, like the grant that you provided to the redevelopment of the city mission through the long-term plan process.
So that would infer that it would have to be funded out of the rate space.
Yes, and effectively, if we were to have a DC waiver, it would get it funded out of the rate space as well anyway, because we couldn't charge it to developers.
So you can't redistribute, okay. Okay, thanks for that clarification. And just on the transport, and I appreciate the staff's review of this policy and hopefully landing costs where the benefits lie and where the demand is generated from. I've previously in the workshops I've raised the importance of, particularly in the greenfields areas, and for transport where there's some very hefty costs, you've got new categories there. But then I go to examine some of the projects, and I look at a project, now I need to find it, say like Penlink or Mill Road. Mill Road is a very long road, and it benefits a lot of different sort of sub-catchments along the way. And I'm just wondering why it, unlike, say, Lincoln Road is broken up into categories, Mill Road is just one continuous, I think it's a $500 million project. I'm just wondering why that cost doesn't sort of fall into smaller catchments.
Mark from Auckland Transport will respond to that.
Mr. Chairman, Mark Fleming from Auckland Transport. The Mill Road is in the DC policy. It's part of the south area, and so the entire Mill Road is part of that one single catchment, and the development share, or the growth share of that project has been assigned to that one single catchment area. In terms of cutting it up, we are going through a process of just confirming the business case and updating the business case to work out which areas will be developed and the sequencing of that. But we only have a single growth percentage for the entire corridor which we're applying. So we haven't tried to cut it up either geographically or in terms of growth areas at all. We've just applied it to that single south catchment.
So if I'm undertaking a development at Mangere Bridge, I'm in the south catchment, and I will be contributing to Mill Road, which is a long way out of, navigation zone. That's correct?
Yes, that would be true for the entire south catchment, for instance, and it is quite a large catchment area that's been defined in the maps. So it goes from, say, the Hauraki area to the south, and then to the west areas there.
And the same applies for Penlink, $200 million project. If I'm tucked down at the bottom of Northcote there, close to a ferry, and we know that people live there because of their commutes to the city, they're in the north catchment, so they are paying for Penlink.
That's correct. So the maps, the transport catchment maps are in the papers. There's probably a reference for them.
I've got that.
Yeah, so the catchment areas, and it's a sort of council choice about where the catchment areas lie, but they've been defined relatively large, and there's groups of infrastructure within the catchment which, while there might be a Penlink, there'll also be other projects in the north or in the south. While there might be a Mill Road, there'll be other projects throughout that area that all areas in the south, for instance, contribute to.
Okay.
Okay, councillors, if I can just remind you, we've got another major item on the agenda, plus we've got a workshop starting at 1 o'clock. I know it's been a long, hard week, but if we can just try to keep our comments in the comment session that we're going into now to the point and as brief as possible. So, Councillor Newman, you've got the first call.
Yeah, thank you. Look, Your Worship, growth has to fund itself. It has to contribute to the delivery of infrastructure to offset the impact of growth. I think the Local Government Act requires, and actually the court has upheld this, it requires causation, but beyond causation there is an established principle, and this policy needs to reflect that not only do we have to address causation, but also the benefits received from the delivery of infrastructure provided. Infrastructure provided will benefit new residents. It will also benefit existing residents. And the court upheld that, and I wonder actually if the decision of the court in relation to the Neil Group versus North Shore City, because that's quite an old decision now, but it is still probably preeminent when it comes to the issue of how you deliver major transmission infrastructure that Councillor Darby was talking about to reflect both the requirement for developers to fund the causal nexus between growth and infrastructure, as well as the benefits to the community wider than just the new residents. So I want to say that in relation to the transmission infrastructure that has been named, that you cannot easily break the transmission infrastructure down into small catchments. It has to be funded by a wide catchment of Auckland, because there will be benefits to a wider group of people who use that transmission infrastructure, whether it be a major highway or a new pipeline or whatever. Aucklanders will have to fund that, and it will be more than just contributions. North Shore City Council tried to use contributions disproportionately to fund the Northern Busway. It was subject to judicial review, and the developers won. So that's a very important point, and the jurisprudence has been established. Your Worship, notwithstanding that, if Housing New Zealand develop a whole suite of new townhouses within a precinct, Housing New Zealand can reasonably expect, and we should ensure, that they do fund the traffic islands, the light controlled crossings, what have you. They will make a fair and proportionate contribution to that, and Auckland Transport has to provide for that. Your Worship, one of the things about this policy, and it's where this council is vulnerable, is on the issue of the break-even point that's critical to determining the allocation of cost for growth versus the backlog. Because when you look at a lot of these projects, there's a lot of backlog, there's stuff that hasn't been done previously, and to try and retrospectively fund that backlog through contributions is not something we can do. So we will have to demonstrate that we are making good on our asset management plans to bring dilapidated playgrounds and halls and facilities back to a standard that's appropriate for communities. The final thing I want to say, Your Worship, is with respect to parks. And I think that this is where causation and benefits received gets really hard, that local parks that are delivered as part of a new development can be relatively easily identified as a benefit for new communities as part of a new development. But it gets really, really hard at regional parks, because it will be a much wider constituency of Aucklanders that benefit from a new regional park than just a new group of people who have come here. So that is why the majority of costs in relation to regional parks, acquisition of regional parks, that will have to be funded by all of Aucklanders. Contributions will contribute to that somewhat, but I think that the cost will sit primarily with the existing constituency of Aucklanders through rates. So, Your Worship, I'm happy to have this consultation with the development community, but I am pleased that we've moved the date out to the 23rd of November, because we will have to be seen to be taking seriously the submissions that we receive, which I'm sure will be comprehensive and which will address the principles that the court has previously set.
Thank you. Councillor Simpson, last comment. Oh, sorry, Councillor Cashmore after that.
We look the same. No, I didn't have a comment. I just said it wasn't me.
Oh, it wasn't you? Okay. Deputy Mayor Cashmore.
Thanks. I think, and I agree with Councillor Newman on many of these areas. And we have some big variances that the developers haven't seen before, with the costs generally standardised. And for instance, we've got a Papakura Manurewa DC that's going up to 42,000 as compared to neighbouring Manukau at 22,000. And there's going to be some shocks to the systems out there. And at some point, I want to see the breakdown for things like Mill Road, for instance, or Penlink, because the actual benefit doesn't just lie with your proximity community, it lies over the whole city, especially with the areas that are major infrastructure routes like Mill Road with 10 million tonnes of aggregate helping build the city centre. So I'd like to think it's a big contribution flying back that way. So the question I'd like to answer, Andrew or Ross, is that are the developers aware of the amount of variance this new policy is going to bring in?
So some of that the overall increase and some of that variance will have been clear to the developers when we initially spoke with them in May, because there were variances then that we referred to in our advice to you. I think it was different examples, but they were there. So yes, they'll have an inkling that was coming, although some of the detail and where that variance is will have changed now that we've generated a policy with the greater detail they required.
Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Clow.
Yeah, no comment other than I just want to thank the team, Andrew and Ross and Bobby and others for the work they did on this.
Complex.
I think it's very good and very clear. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Darby.
And just briefly, I also acknowledge the team as I did before, but I think as we get into this, I still need greater clarity about how those costs fall in the greenfields areas. And I've cited the Mill Road project. It is really a state highway, and I thought we were going to push for that project to be transferred to the state, to the Crown. I think we've taken the foot off the pedal on that one, and in doing so, we're incurring a $500 million tab. But that basically goes from Pukekohe all the way right up to Manurewa and Manukau. And it's and when I see that, and it's always been talked about as a growth-related project, yet only 31% of it is going to be covered by DCs. I'm not convinced that that reflects where the costs and the causation really is for that road. I've heard echoed in this chamber that it is one of the most important growth-related projects, yet the costs are falling to the tune of 69% from other sources. The other sources is existing ratepayers. So I'm concerned about that. The same for Pendelink. And when I examine some of the greenfields costs and where they fall, I look at the new category of Drury South. All I can see is one $10 million project for Drury South. So it looks like there's a category that's going to pay a bit more, but when you come to the cost line, it's only a $10 million project. So I'm going to be looking at what we do get back in submissions here, but I think we'll hear from our public that they want a better breakdown and some even more transparency, particularly on the greenfields projects in the transport area I'm mainly referring to. Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Well, we're going to, obviously, when this comes back to us, we're going to be looking at the same issues, but with the basis of information, of feedback, and any expressions of concern. And as I said before, our officers will be listening to those concerns, and where a case is made out, making changes. We have to keep within the law. We have to follow the guidelines. And equally, developers and the people who benefit from developers are going to have to pay their share. So the recommendations are before you, which is to agree to consult and with delegated authority to the Chair of Finance and Performance and the CFO and the consultation process. So I'll put that resolution. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. Carried. We come to item 10, which is to note that in confidential we will be having a discussion about the process of shareholder approval for the Wynyard Quarter. I think we can keep our debate to confidential unless there's any desire to ask questions before then. So I'll move accordingly, seconded by Councillor Fletcher. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. Carried.
I'd like to record my vote against.
Okay. In this session,
It was meant to be about public consultation, and we're going into secrecy.
Well, there's a reason for that, councillor, and you can vote against the confidential motion if you choose.
It's Orwellian.
And the reason is that the report contains sensitive information about a commercial transaction. So I'll move that we exclude the public for the discussion of confidential item number 1. Those been seconded by Councillor Clow. Those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no.
Aye.
Recorded,
Carried.
please.
Recorded, Councillors Lee and Watson.